here, and he is a member of the Boston Society for Descriptive Psychology Study Group. He's currently completing a doctoral thesis for the clinical PsyD program at William James College. Developed his professional interest in anger management while working with court-ordered clients at the Psychological Center Outpatient Counseling Center, which is located in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And he's currently working as a full-time community residence counselor at McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts, where he co-facilitates a weekly dual diagnosis integrated group therapy meetings. This presentation is directly related to ongoing theoretical doctoral project that he's doing, so he is looking for feedback. And so, please welcome Erol Zeybekoglu. Reminder at a certain
That would be great if maybe about
minutes or
15-20 minutes till the
to the end?
yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Hi everybody. Thank you for having me here. I am thrilled to be in Colorado. This is my first time in Colorado, and this is my first meeting with the Society for Descriptive Psychology, so I want to just thank you all again for welcoming me into your community. The reason why I start my discussion by thanking you for including me is that I feel duly appraised in my introduction into this community. And that is in no small part due to the fact that over the last year and change, I have been sort of ramping up my level of involvement in the Boston Study Group and really taking some time to understand the ins and outs of this community, and also to, more importantly, really become familiar with the conceptual language and the ideas that are presented in Osorio's work and the other essays that have been developed, other thoughts, other ideas, other concepts that are really integral to the types of academic and social work that this group does. The reason why I have made this effort to learn how you do what you do and learn how you make sense of the world is because I see it as being, in some ways, effective, not only for meeting other academics and sharing ideas, but also in terms of gaining conceptual clarity, and by doing that, really taking some of the guesswork out of a lot of the concepts that we have to do. Now that we deal with. And now that's not to say that there aren't a tremendous amount of issues that get raised, but because I take this on as a more global process of acculturating myself to your group, it actually facilitates my ability to use the concepts and the tools in a way that can be effective in my own professional and academic goals. So what, you might ask, does this have to do with aggression? As you can see on the projection behind me, my presentation is on aggression. And the reason why I start by talking about community, just like almost every other presenter here, is because community is so integral to every concept that we work with. And I think that it's particularly important to consider when we look at issues of emotional behavior, and particularly anger and aggression. And the reason why is because community has a tremendous amount of significance in the lives of individuals who find themselves behaving in an emotionally driven fashion. So I'd like to start just by referring to Dr. Bergner's explanation of the standard view of emotions from his essay titled Emotions, a Relational View and Its Clinical Applications. In this essay, he does a good job of really clearly stating what is often meant when we run into the emotion concepts in our clinical work, and especially in trying to understand the utility of of existing therapies, it's important to understand that this is often what people are intending when they say emotions, right? And the quote itself is this: the prevailing conception of emotions within psychology today, as it has been for over a century, is that emotion concepts designate certain sorts of affective experiences or feelings. And in this view, terms such as anger, fear, sadness, love, and so forth stand for relatively unique, discriminable, subjective human experiences. However, Dr. Bergner points out an important observation, which is that despite all the theory, research, and clinical practice that has taken as its unspoken assumption that emotions are affective experiences, it is worth noting that this conception has never been scientifically or otherwise demonstrated. He gives a good example in this essay of how we might be able to describe certain emotions that are, when I use a term that you are familiar with, that you might be able to relate it to something similar, but at the same time, and forgive me if I'm paraphrasing here, that at the same time we have no really objective way of pointing to that as something which is that the affective state is the same thing that we're describing. We can compare, but we're at the same time under this model dealing with something of the standard view. We're dealing with something that is hard to work with because we're really just kind of making our best effort to understand the other person. Now, this is Osorio's general case of emotional behavior, and he does what he tends to do in his writing, which is he breaks this concept down into a few key components that are in some sense irreducible. So just reading through it, his general case of emotional behavior is that A, it involves the appraisal of a reality basis. B, this tautologically involves a corresponding motivation. C, the motivation is acted on and it is implemented by enacting behavior that is responsive to specific circumstances. This part is going to be important when we get back to the idea of community and significance. Finally, there is, as others have mentioned today, a learned tendency to act on the appraisal without deliberation. So this is not to say that emotions cannot be deliberated, but there is a learned tendency to act on the appraisal without deliberation because, as is often the case, what we find most useful about emotional responses rather than long, drawn-out, deliberate responses is that they happen quickly, they respond in time, and that they are more effective when they're done so without a lot of, deliberating, etc., right? Now, I want to be clear about this, that it is a learned tendency to act on the appraisal without deliberation. That is not to say that it is not a deliberate action. That is to say that in the moment when you choose to act on it, you do not have to waste time deliberating because you've already learned a tendency to just act on this behavior. And what I'm going to be suggesting today is that in many ways, anger is one of our best examples of this type of behavior. Another good example is going to be fear. So I'd like to just draw a corollary between the two, and as I'm describing emotional behavior with the fear example in the next couple of slides, I want to be clear that I'm not equating fear with anger, but rather that they're both somewhat similar in the way that they are developed as a more automatic response that does not involve as much deliberation, because both tend to correspond to time constraints that other emotions sometimes do not. But, yes?
I think also they have more of a root in the limbic system,
right.
The brain, as opposed to, guilt's not, get as much
right.
Cortextual.
Right, it's that lizard brain. that kicks in both fear and anger, right? It's that basic spinal sort of root that all this other stuff is built on top of, right? Now, I think it's very interesting that the subject of neuroanatomy and everything is being brought up. I have not prepared slides on that, but I think that would be a welcome point of departure when we get around to discussion, because we are talking about behaviors which are both emotional and at the same time very closely tied with an autonomic arousal state. Okay, and this is especially important to consider when we're talking about anger and aggression, as I'm going to frame it. But I want to make one point clear, which is that there are, in many ways, certain functions that tagging specific stimuli with that kind of an autonomic reaction there are implications that are beneficial long term, which may in some ways be somewhat of a higher level emotional behavior, because there's a lot of thought that goes into that. Oh, whoops. Has anyone got a power cord?
I got you covered.
Thank you. All right.
Oh, that's good.
Wow.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so now I'm going to just take a minute to just cover the concept of significance as Osorio describes it. When he describes significance, this is how he puts it, okay? Significance is defined as the parameter, so this parameter codifies the meaningful and or the ulterior aspects of behavior. In general, behavior has a multi-level structure involving A, the behavior which is what the person is up to or what the person is really doing, running out of a room, and one or more implementation behaviors. Oh, I'm sorry. So preserving their safety. I'm sorry, I got that reversed. So the thing that they're really doing is the ulterior motive. They're preserving their safety, and the implementation is something like running out of the room when a lion walks in the door. Okay. So this is the diagram that Osorio gives of this kind of classic model with the intentional action paradigm. Now, keep in mind, this is an intentional behavior based on the significance of, your importance of bodily integrity, safety, all those other kinds of things, recognition of a lion as a threat, your position within the room, recognition of the fact that leaving the room will actually preserve your safety, that you know how to get up and move your feet and get out of the room, and that you perform that and that you can effectively do so is another important thing. But you can see here that in this figure, I ran out of the door to escape danger. That you're recognizing something as a danger. It symbolizes a threat to your physical integrity, even though it's in the form of a large cat, and you're escaping the danger by hauling ass. Okay. So then here we get to see how this expands. Right? We have significances that go beyond our significances. Well, why does it matter that I have my bodily integrity? Well, I want to be able to come home to my family because I value my family, right? Osorio gives a great example of this when he talks about, he gives the example of a farmhouse and a man operating a pump. You observe this individual operating a pump from a distance and you say, what is he doing? Well, he's moving his arm up and down. Well, what has he got in his hand? He's got a pump. Oh, he's pumping something. Well, it's attached to a well, he's pumping water. And then you see that the well is attached to the pump is attached to the house, the farmhouse. And, oh, he's pumping water into the farmhouse, right? Then you know that there are people in there. Well, he's pumping the water into the farmhouse so the people can drink. But then you find out that there's even a deeper significance that the people in the farmhouse are in fact enemies of the state, and he is, I think, he's a co-conspirator or some sort. He's intentionally the water's poisoned, and he's intentionally poisoning the people in the house. So the significance broadens out. Yes, sir?
But then there's the top level, which is what's he actually doing? He's saving the nation.
Saving the nation. That's right. Okay, yeah, that's right. So they're co-conspirators. So the broadening of the whole thing, each level of behavior corresponds to a broader level of significance, and in this case, it nicely fits into his place in the community. Right? He's preserving his community. And now we have an even more kind of general version of this, where you can see that all we have to do is just embed this intentional action diagram within a larger one, which is for the broader significance, and we have a nice model for seeing what the person is really doing. Okay? Now, this is where I get back to Bergner, because I think that his view of emotions as a relational concept is very useful when we start to think about anger management. And I'd like to just take a moment to just speak anecdotally about teaching anger management within the community of Lawrence. Lawrence is it's about, I would say, I don't know, like 5-10 miles north of like the Boston area.
30.
Oh, like 30, yeah, I'm sorry, I was driving it, like, I guess, yeah, at about an hour commute, that's probably a better description of it, right? So it's like 30 miles north of Boston, and it's, interestingly enough, it's surrounded by a number of pretty well-to-do neighborhoods, but it itself is totally, like, abandoned in terms of social resources. I would say, like, maybe 50% of the population is unemployed. There are a number of people who are caught in this sort of like quagmire with the courts, where they get arrested for a behavior, then they're put on they're either detained for a period of time, then they're put on probation. They have a probation officer who's overloaded with a huge caseload. The probation officer gets paid every time that they show up. So anytime that they violate probation, if they miss a drug screen, or they miss an appointment, or they miss a therapy, a court-ordered therapy treatment, then they reset the clock on their probation, and they're paying out more money. And it's like this really entrenched thing. Like you get a feeling for it. These people have, in many ways, really lost faith in the system that's supposed to be there to protect them, because when the system gets involved, everybody gets screwed over. Like, everybody involved gets screwed over. So I want to just keep that in mind, okay? That this is like what the actual day-to-day experience of what being at court is like, what dealing with the police is like, what all these things signify for people in this community, right? Now, we're going to move back to Bergner now, because I want to start thinking about how this plays into emotion, okay? And as we go along, I'm also going to try to attempt to tie this in with community as we start to talk about behaviors that are emotionally based, like hostility, etc. Okay, but first I want to have a clear understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about emotionally motivated behavior. And I think that Bergner's model is, in many ways, much more useful than the current standard view, which is what the courts really expect people to be teaching in cognitive behavioral therapy-based anger management treatment. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but basically the current manual, which is provided by the state of Massachusetts, it may be different in different areas, is a CBT-based manual. There's a little bit of REBT mixed in there, but it's basically where you're supposed to look at the connection between your appraisal of a situation, right? Your cognitive appraisal of a situation, and then you're supposed to correct your thinking about it, and then in addition to that, you're supposed to lower your autonomic bodily reaction, which is this learned tendency to act without deliberation, to kickstart your autonomic nervous system. That you're supposed to somehow have a combination of appraisal, of changing your appraisal, trying different coping mechanisms, and then ultimately trying different kinds of interventions. And I'll credit them with that. They do actually talk about some social interventions, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we go on. But first of all, this relational view, I think, is much more useful in these types of situations. And as I was, getting familiar with this kind of thing, and I was really starting to rethink what was going on in these classes, I started to understand something, which is that when people were telling me that this wasn't going to work, it wasn't because they were lazy or because they were not at a ready state of change. It was because, it would be considered, in many cases, provocative in their own neighborhoods to try to stop and do this stuff when someone's calling you out. There's an excellent example that I got from one of my clients. He was talking about being put on blast. Have any of you ever heard this term, being put on blast? Right. So being put on blast is essentially being called out for something that you did wrong in front of a large group of people, so that you kind of have to, basically in front of the community, and it's in many ways an attempt at a degradation ceremony, right? And you're put on blast, meaning that you are asked to somehow, in that moment, whether you're ready or not, represent yourself in a way that's better than what you seem like, right? And this ties in, as we go on, very much with Osorio's conception of a degradation ceremony and the role of the actor, observer, critic in that type of a process. But when we talk about the emotional piece, right, we're talking about what's happening in the moment when something is, in this case, being provocative. So I want to talk about it this way because I think this gives a more realistic view of what I'm actually running into, and especially when people describe, situations where they say, I didn't even get angry in this situation. Sure, I acted violently. Sure, I held these hostile beliefs, and I still hold them, but I did not lose my temper. And in many cases, they're kind of full of it. But even if I realize, even if they're not full of it, even if they did get angry, that we often discuss legitimate forms of anger, right? If you're being unfairly treated, you should be angry about that, right? Or if you're not, that, and as Bergner suggests, that calls for some explanation. If it's a situation where you would normally be expected to be angry and you're not, then something is up. There's something kind of going amiss, right? And anger, like fear, can be adaptive, okay? What we're not trying to do here is eliminate anger. What we're trying to do is help people understand how to effectively manage it. So, let me just stop on my sort of digression and introduce this view of emotions, because I think it's fantastic. So, this model proposes that that emotions involve A, the perception by a person of a relationship between himself or herself and some object. That could be another person, or it can even be an inanimate object in some cases. As we talk about significance, we're going to broaden that out to say, well, the object might represent something, but we're not going to go there right yet, okay? And then B, the appraisal of which logically carries motivational significance. This is important. And C, the nature of which is such that the individual has a learned tendency to act on it without deliberation, okay? And I'm just going to take a minute to go through each of these points in a bit more detail. Okay, so first off, emotion words denote appraised relationships. So if we take the following content-free formula, X is an appraised blank to P, our emotion terms denote the perceived relationship between X and P. So thus, fear designates the perceived relationship. X is an appraised danger or threat to P. Anger designates the relationship that X is an appraised provocation to P. And frustration designates the relationship X is desired but unattainable, and so forth, okay? This provides a good example of how we assess what we're dealing with. We look at what's happening in front of us and we figure out what it means, but we feel the relationship that we help hold to it. We don't necessarily figure out what it means in the conventional sense, like, oh, I wonder what so-and-so stepping on my brand new shoes signifies. We just feel it. We get angry in that moment. And anyone who's ever had any kind of an anger management problem knows what this feels like. And I would say at least everyone in the room has experienced anger. Can I at least get that much? Okay. Because I think that, it happens, okay? It's part of life. There's nothing wrong with it. Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with just the feeling, but we'll get into the more. Nothing necessarily wrong, okay? It could be a misattribution, but that's a different issue. The second point, I really like this one. Emotional relationships logically carry motivational significance. So, to see something as a triangle is to see it as a three-sided, two-dimensional enclosed figure. That is a logical. That's a logical. That's just a logical inherent quality of triangles, right? Similarly, to see a person as a bachelor is to see that person as unmarried. Sorry, that's a typo. I'm not autocorrect. Well, it's trying to autocorrect my social life here. All right. Okay. So the relationship between the two terms God, again, forgive the auto types thing. I'm sorry. I thought using my phone I was being a smart ass.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Anyways, it's a bit of a faux pas. Okay. Anyways, but you know, they carry logical. I'm sorry. This is total dark. I'm sorry. Okay. So to see something as trying to, so this is like a necessary relationship between the quality of it and the thing itself. Like to say bachelor, you're saying an unmarried male, right? That's like inherent. You can't have a right, but similarly, what Berger suggests, which I think is great, is that you know when we talk about emotional terms, that we are talking about something that is inherent to those terms, right? So when something provokes us, we really, you know, for example, right? Let me start with fear, right? If something you know is perceived as a danger, then we logically have a reason to avoid it. And if something is seen as a provocation, whether it actually is or not, we logically have a reason to either be hostile or react in whatever way. And some people shut down. Some people have different ways of dealing with it. But we have a reason to be hostile, okay? Hostility is the one that we're trying to adjust, but it's not the one, but it's still the one that kind of naturally follows. So the second piece is really intended just to point out that there's often a logical symmetry. So we're not talking about someone being illogical here. We're not talking about someone being too impulsive to think about their values or something. They have but we run into this third problem, which is this it's not a problem, but it's something that can be more problematic when the first two go awry, which is this learned tendency to act without deliberation. So in many circumstances, such behavior is either highly adaptive or at worst presents no problems. However, in other circumstances, insufficiently considered action might prove imprudent, unethical, and or inappropriate. Emotional relationships then, by their nature, lend themselves to problems with self-control. I feel like this sentence right here really captures where people get the anger management referral, because they act too quickly and they have this emotional response. But it's important to remember that first part, which is that in most situations, it will either be highly adaptive or at worst present no problem. Okay? And what I'm suggesting is that many of the behaviors that people get referred to in anger management are situations where, given their life and their set of circumstances, their community values, these are the highly adaptive and present no problem type behaviors, okay? Because many of these individuals who I've met, who are really actually often very sweet and like nice and, you know, like open people, that they are in a situation where when I ask them, like, well, what could you have done differently? They're like, what are you joking? Like, what do you mean, what could I have done differently? I basically did what I knew how to do, what I knew was the right thing to do in that situation, and I did it in a timely way so that I got what I wanted to accomplish done. Now, after the fact that I, rushed the cop who was trying to arrest my brother, sure, the cop, in my mind, unfairly then arrested me, but I was actually behaving fairly. In my community, if someone's messing with your family member, you take action into your own hand. And as we get into more community value stuff, I'm going to talk about the idea of sanctioned violence. We have sanctioned violence in our society today. It's the police. We've already talked about this a number of times. We sanction these certain individuals to make these judgments, right? But basically the way that we do it's a little bit different than the way that people do it on a smaller community basis. On a smaller community basis, it's not always done by designating a certain individual. Sometimes it is. Sometimes, if you got an older brother who's the, ass kicker in the house and somebody messes with you, you go to your older brother because he's the designated ass kicker. He's got a cool head, he knows how to discern the situation, and he knows how to handle it, right? But at the same time, the general rule of thumb is actually very similar to what we imagine with the police, which is that we have certain individuals who are better or worse at figuring when the appropriate use of violence is, and especially in a situation where the cops might not show up at your house if you, in time if you call them, and when you are in a situation where it's actually police officers who are abusing their power and taking advantage of you, that you feel you know what, in my neighborhood, if someone comes in and busts my door and tries to grab me without saying anything, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to fight back, right? That's a sanctioned form of violence in that environment, right? But then the cop brings him to the court brings him to the parole officer, and the parole officer says, you got an anger management problem, you got to go to therapy, right? And then they end up in the clinic, and they're like, what am I doing here? You think I'm going to go home and act any differently than this, right? Now, I personally am actually quite a big fan of CBT, like in terms of how it's been helpful for me, because when I had issues with either anger or anxiety, what have you, it was first of all, they were closely related to anxiety, and second of all, they were things that I could really see applying in my day-to-day life. They worked out in my community as well as the community of the anger management class that I was a part of when I first got introduced to these concepts, and it was really effective for me. So like when I got out to Lawrence, my immediate thought was like, you know what, I managed to figure this stuff out. Why can't these people figure it out? Why can't they be more like me? And it took me a while to figure out that's totally the wrong way to be going about it. Because what I really needed to do is I needed to acculturate myself to them. I needed to understand what their day-to-day life was, and I needed to understand what their community and values were. And so if they tell me they don't have an anger management problem, my first reaction used to be like, oh, well, then how'd you end up here, right? Eventually it started to be, okay, so what's driving this? Like, what's getting you to this point where you're in this class? Maybe you don't have an anger management problem. Maybe you do, but maybe your anger management style is a problem in certain places, even though it's not a problem in most places for you. Maybe in most places it's adaptive. So who are we to really be the judge here? Well, that's a separate issue. But I do think that, I just want to be clear, I'm not endorsing violence. But, moving on with this point, another important point that Berger makes is that the traditional psychoanalytic focus on enhancing the strength and mastery of the ego over the id, and in the ever-increasing predominance of cognitive therapy, stressing the reduction of problematic emotions, we have thought processes and the emergence of a literature on emotional intelligence, emphasizing the importance of being able to act on the basis of prudential-oriented thinking and not emotional impulse. These are all ample testimony to this. And this might also be poorly transcribed. I apologize for that. But the basic idea is that by taking this categorical approach of treating certain types of emotional behaviors as maladaptive, just because they're maladaptive in our communities doesn't necessarily mean that they're viewed that way, that the significance is the same in a different environment. Okay. All right. So now we're moving into the more community-based stuff and status. And I think status is an incredibly useful tool when you're thinking about anger management. I'd like to make a quick point about this before I get into Asoria's definition, or sort of points of reference, which is that I just want to be clear. Status is dynamic, right? We hear this term status dynamic maxims, and we often think about status as kind of like a hierarchy. But I think perhaps a better model for it would be kind of like almost like just a cohesion with your community set of values, that the person who finds himself in a higher authority in many ways acts as a better representative of values, or as someone who introduces more useful values. Yes?
I find it useful to keep those things sorted out by reminding myself that status is a specific cluster of permissions and expectations for the individual within that community.
Okay.
So it has nothing to do with standing or power.
Okay. All right. So let's keep. Then I appreciate that, because I don't want to get off on the wrong track here. So keeping it within the boundaries of what is expected and what is required, what is not allowed, etc., we can view it more basically as inclusion and exclusion criteria, which can impact behavior. and consider the fact that when you are in a limited, impoverished sort of a community, that you do not necessarily have a lot of options outside of your immediate community members in terms of getting resources and getting needs met. You know, you need to be able to get a ride from your mother-in-law to work even though you can't stand her, or, you know, whatever, right? It's like you have certain limitations on your options, on what you have as behavioral options at the time. So the way that so getting back to the text, right? Osorio uses this term, you know, a place for everything and everybody and everything in its place. That I think that was maybe a typo on my part. The concept of status assignment is the concept of giving something a place in the scheme of things, and they approach and Osorio importantly approaches this through special cases of degradation and accreditation. Now, for the purpose of understanding aggression, I think it's really important that we focus on degradation. But I want to make a slight aside, which is that in some communities, aggression, violence, or hostility can also be markers of accreditation. You know, you win a fight, you fit in more, you get more resources, right? People get out of your way when you're walking down the street, that kind of thing, right? Oh, and also I want to just point out the fact that any of these individuals that we might be talking about are members of multiple communities, and that often, and that another major source of conflict is when a person is standing in a situation where, you know, as Tony would describe it, they're in an intractable values type of a situation. I think it's possible to belong to two communities that are mostly commensurate, except they have a couple values that are not, right? So, you know, you're trying to explain to your therapist everything about your life, but there are a couple things you don't mention to him because you know he's going to tell you that that's a problem, right? Or, you know, you're in front of your you're in front of your family members and you don't talk about stuff that you talk to your therapist about, right? So, but this idea of degradation ceremonies is, I think, very important for understanding what function hostility often has when we broaden it out to the broader significance. What I'm suggesting, and this is, in many ways still in its kind of infancy as a thought process, so I'm not by any means suggesting that this is an exhaustive account of hostility, but that in many cases, I think it's important to note that degradation ceremony, that hostility serves as a degradation ceremony, and that that aggressive behavior and even violence in many ways serves as a degradation of your status, and in some cases, and I'm not going to get into the details of kind of your clout within a group, but that it can also affect those types of factors from my experience as well. So, all right. So when we look at degradation ceremonies, there's some key components. First off, there's a community of people having a set of values such that adherence to those values is a condition of being purely and simply one of us. Paradigmatically, there are three distinct participants designated as the perpetrator, the denouncer, and the witness, or as you might also frame it, the actor, observer, and critic. The denouncer and the witness act in the interest of the community in two senses. A, acting as denouncer or witness reflects a person's good standing in the community. And B, the denouncer and the witness act in the interest of the community and not out of mere personal motivation. And if we look at the procedure of degradation ceremonies, you might start to see that this does in many ways, I think, accurately describe some of what we see when people are referred in for anger management. The denouncer tells the witness that the perpetrator has committed a certain act. The denouncer redescribes the act if necessary so that the tautology that the act as redescribed is a violation of those community values. And the denouncer makes whatever case needs to be made to effect that the act as redescribed is a genuine expression of the perpetrator's character and is not to be explained away, e.g. by reference to extraordinary circumstances or an atypical state of mind. I'd like to point out that this does not necessarily need to be communicated as explicitly as certain communities do this. There are some communities where these things can happen very non-verbally, and there can be a tremendous amount of emphasis placed on what that person ought to already know. But even and those things may have been made explicit, they may have been implicit, but it's in many communities it can be assumed that certain things are understood as being a part of that community. And also it's important that you don't need for the other person to understand why they're being degraded in order to perform a degradation ceremony. In fact, often the reason why they're evoking the degradation ceremony is because they don't understand what they did wrong. And you don't want them in your community because they can't act as a member in good standing representing the community values well. So now we're getting into status dynamic maxims of place, which is an important piece of this because originally I had made a good effort to transcribe all of these maxims into my PowerPoint slides, and I was going to try to kind of get a discussion going. Well, which ones of these are going to fit in? And then I was reading Tony's paper on community, intractable community differences and values, and there was just already a really good collection of them. So I kind of parsed it down to Tony's list. But if we look at what these maxims are meant to achieve, right? The maxims are discursively appropriate forms for couching warnings and reminders, particularly in contrast to simple statements of fact. The maxims are characterized as dynamic because they codify the logical forms for giving an account of why people do what they do and they don't do what they don't do. The central explanatory notion codified by the maxims is that of a person's place in the scheme of things. Since place is related to, or is equivalent to status, the maxims are characterized not merely as dynamic, but as status dynamic. And the list, which here we go. So these are the ones that Tony had sussed out as being related to community, and I thought that this would be maybe a more useful list for us to kind of have up for the discussion when we're talking about maxims that might be related to this, okay? And try to think about these in the context of a specific hostile act. I want to kind of generate a bit of discussion here where we think about real exceptions to these instances, because I'm hoping that by presenting to you as a community, we'll get a sense of where the boundaries of this suggestion are. I don't expect it to go as far as explaining every hostile behavior, but I am confident that it's gonna be surprisingly effective when we keep in mind our ability to broaden out significance and have the end goal be to lead to a concept of significance that relates back to the community and values and views the hostile behavior as a degradation ceremony, okay? So how are we doing on time?
You have about 20 minutes.
Perfect. Okay, I was hoping that we would have a good amount of time to generate some discussion about this. But up here we have some, I'll read through these maxims. I got one more page of maxims. I'm going to read through those, and then we'll start the conversation because I want to hear what some of your thoughts are about this. So first of all, a person requires a world in order to have the possibility of engaging in any behavior at all, okay? Usually this is the one that's most proximal to your day-to-day life and makes sense, right? Because remember, the reason why people align themselves, even with people in their own community, is because they may view certain aspects of that community as things that help make sense out of the world that they both share, or the environment that they both share. A9, a person takes the world to be as he has found it to be. So we're not going to see a lot of highly intellectualized CBT kind of concepts floating around in communities where they don't have as much utility or recognition or education. The world is subject to reformulation by persons. This is something that's not always apparent to people, but it is actually a case. person requires community in order for it to be possible for him to engage in human behavior at all. And I think this is an important piece, which is that when we invite someone into anger management, it's often a time-limited thing. They're there for what, like 10 weeks or 10 to 12 weeks, and then they're gone, right? They go back to their own community. So we're suggesting that they do things in such a way that they would be somehow, that they might be degraded or excluded from their community, and then we're saying, shove off, I'll see you later. We're not inviting them into a permanent community. We're bringing them into our community for a couple of days, saying, hey, you should be more like us, and then sending them back out into their community and saying, hey, how come you didn't change the water? You're boiling out there, and you're not enough of a coffee bean, so to speak, right? So the community is characterized by a common world, language, a structure of social practices, statuses, ways of living, choice principles, and individual members. A person's place in the community provides reasons and opportunities to engage in one behavior rather than another. So that reasons and opportunities, right? Again, these are going to really limit and guide behavior. To engage in deliberate actions to participate in the social practice of the community. So you need to have that point of reference in order to know what to do in that situation. We might be able to enhance someone's options by giving them some CBT skills, but they're still going to be in a community where they could potentially be excluded. So it might be more pragmatic for them to just do what they were doing before. Although it's hard to do that from jail, right? And jail is not fun in Lawrence. It's not fun anywhere, I'm sure, but it's really not fun in Lawrence. The behavior of one person with respect to another is a participation in at least one of the social practices of his community. So we got to know what those are before we start making claims about what the person should be doing. They may have good interventions that don't involve physical violence or the things that are being said you can't, that's a no-no. But they need to be one of the ones that already exist in that community in order for it to be something that they would be able to sustain. The person's world's made of possibilities and non-possibilities for acting. That's, I'm not sure exactly, but that also has to do with personal history and capacity. And status takes precedence over fact. And if a person engages in an intrinsic social practice, that calls for no further explanation. Okay? I'm going to move on to one more thing. And if you guys want to, we can just start with the discussion here. Yeah?
Could you just flip back to the previous
Sure.
slide,
Yeah.
for a moment? Just a quick comment. As I look at those, and I think what I was trying to do, the ones that strike me as being really the money shots here are F1 and H3.
F1 and H3. Okay, so the behavior.
H3.
H3. Absolutely. And keeping in mind that, our ability, our capacity to engage in a behavior depends on two things. One, what kind of opportunities we have, and two, what kind of restrictions there are on our behavior. And what kind of opportunities violating those restrictions will cost us. Because we often kind of conceptualize this sort of Darwinian survival thing as a bunch of individuals, kind of like seeing who can get the most resources or whatever. But it's obviously more of a community-based sort of a thing. And these degradation ceremonies actually function very well for preserving the community at large, especially when it's in a hostile environment, which often in many communities it is. Okay. So then we're getting back to just the idea of persons and communities. So many of these are things that we've already gone over, but I want to point out a couple here, which are going to be more specific to what we're talking about. Okay, but the significance of a person's behavior or what he is doing by that. In every case, this includes participating in a community social practices. Thus, the significance of a person's behavior always includes acting as one of us. In some cases, this is a relatively unimportant fact regarding the behavior. In the case of core practices, it is an essential fact. So, this is just, I think, an important thing to just acknowledge, whole hog, which is that whatever the person came in, whatever behavior they engaged in, that whether it's an emotional behavior, a highly deliberated behavior, whatever it is, that to some extent, that reflects something about their community. And until we understand their community better, we're not going to really understand that behavior. And so to just write it off as a non-intelligible behavior, especially when the person has full capacities, no significant head trauma, no significant mental illness impairing their capacity to reason and engage in deliberate action, then we're missing a huge piece of this by not considering how their behavior actually draws from and fits into some community. It doesn't have to be the one that they're currently living in. It could have been the community that they got forced to live in when they were in prison, and they come out and they're back in the regular community and they're still acting like they're in prison. But it's some community that they once became a member of and had to, for whatever reason, adopt the practices of. And it could be the situation where they have to adopt the practices not because they value those things, but simply because it would be so imprudent and physically harmful to violate those expectations, right? And also, and this part I thought was really interesting. A person is conscious as whatever status he acts as. What he sees in the world around him, in particular, what he sees as possibilities and non-possibilities for actors, differs according to his status. So this is another thing that I think gets back to the point about what people's options are, which is the question of acting as your status, not necessarily acting because of an acknowledgement of your status. This is the actor knowledge, right? They know how to be a thief. They don't think about why they're a thief, right? They know how to play baseball. They don't think about the value of playing baseball. They act as a ball player. They don't try to necessarily reinvent the game or consider the value of whatever. But yeah, and with that being said, open it to discussion. Yes.
Okay. So here's this person who's blasted or who attacks the cops who's attacking his brother. So he gets in trouble. This guy gets in trouble. He comes to you. So how does this inform or change what you do with him? What do you do with him that is guided by this kind of thinking?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so there are a couple of things that I will do when actually working with somebody. One is that I will frame their arrest as a limitation of behavior potential once they get out of jail and they get back into the community. I'm not going to tell them that the problem was necessarily that you violated the cops' values. The problem that I will usually point out is that, well, guess what? If you value taking care of your family, it's going to be really hard to get a job when you get out of jail. Did you think about that broader significance of that? Or if you really value being able to, not have to deal with court-ordered anger management, or not have to deal with, like, if that's what you really value, then you can think about this behavior as having that broader consequence, and by that virtue, kind of having a different kind of significance than you may have thought at the time, by not considering the potential consequence, or by thinking that, I'm such a hot shit, I'm not going to get caught for this, or whatever, right? The other thing that I'll often do is I will really try to understand what they were trying to accomplish by doing that. And if part of what they were trying to accomplish was to defend the safety of a family member from even a police officer, I will just verbally kind of accredit them for that. Be like, hey, I think we all care about that, I think that, and by kind of generating an ethos in that group, whereby it's okay to think about alternative ways of achieving that, by first starting with what's the significance of it and how can we figure out a way that better fits your individual needs, then that I find to be a bit more effective. It's not always effective because sometimes people don't like the means which I suggest, which are things like CBT interventions. But I'm trying to think a little bit more about the cognitive behavioral method as kind of like a tool which can be used for a broader purpose, and if it doesn't work, then we throw it out the window. But I usually will keep it just for a structured sort of an intervention. I'm sorry, one more, yes, go ahead.
So it makes, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, and those examples are good ones, but what about something like someone who loses his temper with his wife or she with him,
Mhm.
and it's harder to see that as well,
Yes.
So you'd still be looking at what are you trying to do, but tell us.
Well, okay,
give us
so this is I think an important example because it does come up in a number of cases. It's important to understand that the current standard treatment for domestic violence is slightly different than the current standard treatment for anger management, insofar as people who are arrested for domestic violence often get referred to a domestic violence-based program, which often focuses more on enhancing empathy, interestingly enough. And I think that, now that you're bringing this up, I think this is an area which a number of people in this room might be highly qualified to examine and think about how they might be able to enhance or refine that process. Because right now it's very, it's got mixed, I don't have the exact statistics, but what I do know is this, that if someone comes into my group for a chronic domestic violence type situation, I often would refer them out to a domestic violence program because it's not a matter of, in that type of a situation, simply losing one's temper in a situation that's like a malappropriate use of that sort of good intention temper. It's often due to a lack of emotional recognition of what the other person's experienced, and that sometimes requires more specific intervention on that part. Because a lot of when we talk about things that people are reticent to consider, domestic violence is definitely up there. And I think because October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I think it's really important that we do kind of acknowledge that and recognize that it is still a major problem in this country, and one which unfortunately I don't know if this particular type of intervention is the only tool that people are going to need to solve that one. But I'm glad that you brought that up. Yes?
But the connection that you're making is wonderful, because if you don't understand the behavior and its significance to the person, how the heck are you going to change it?
And more importantly, how the hell are you going to connect with them and engage them?
Exactly.
Because they're just going to check out. They're like, this doesn't mean anything.
So connecting is affirming what it was they were trying to do.
Right.
And then generating the alternatives.
Yeah.
Well, it's the appeal to what matters as well. So when you say, if it matters to you to take care of your family, you're not going to do that if you do this.
Mm-hmm.
Limit your behavior potential.
Mm-hmm. You can just close it. I think it must have turned off a while ago. Okay. Yeah.
Well, it sounds pretty clearly that anger management is not a good locution for what you're up to, because fundamentally you're not focusing on managing the feeling or anything else. It's more along the lines of status management. You're working with them to help them understand how to manage their place in the world and what their behavior does.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that. That's actually I think a much clearer terminology for this, because the anger is not even necessarily the point that I'm making significant here. So yeah, you got a good point there.
And in the archives of Descriptive, there is a paper with that exact title.
Oh, okay.
Written by Benta Sternberg.
Oh, with which
What title?
Status management.
status management? Okay, that's excellent.
Whole
So
paper for you.
excellent. That's perfect.
Is it Pete and Benta? I forget.
Pete and Benta and Pete.
Yeah.
She did it with collaboration for I think she was the
primary.
Awesome.
It's criminal justice oriented.
Yeah. Well, that's even better. Even better.
Another social worker.
We're here. We just don't admit it. I've had a lot of social workers go to great lengths to not admit that they're social workers.
Oh, she's in your favors.
We are running a little bit behind. Do we have time for one or two quick ones?
Yeah.
Well, one of the ways that, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
One of the ways that domestic violence programs can be very powerful is that they offer an alternative community with an alternative set of choice principles, alternative world, alternative statuses. And we all belong to various communities, and that community belongingness is a very powerful basis for behavior. And golly gee, I mean, you've described these situations that are basically embedded in a personal and a community way of life. And it sure would be nice to be able to have an alternative community
Absolutely.
that could instill, develop, provide an avenue for discovery of alternative choice principles, how they work, and that there's a community that values those. And they make a community of men, etc.
Yeah, and I think just to bring it back to Bergner's article, he made a really good point about the clinical applications of this theory, which are that you basically have three clear options for adjusting the emotional reaction. One, and correct me if I'm in any ways misquoting this, right? That one, that the individual can change their appraisal of the situation or do the kind of CBT type thing, right? The second option would be to, if that can just turn it off, I guess. If you close the thing, it'll stop. If you close the thing, it'll stop singing. Okay. But the second way of doing it is to adjust the situation itself so the relational components are arranged differently. But that's often very difficult to suggest. The third option is to find an alternative way to get those needs met. And I think that what you're talking about right now, about creating a secondary community where those needs can be met and where you can have different status, then you can bring that feeling of accomplishment back home with you, and you don't feel so insulted by someone in your house who's yelling at you. You say, hey, I got friends somewhere else. I'm not that bad of a guy.
Yeah, and back to what Tony said, I think there would be heuristic value in changing the name from anger management
to status management. Yeah, I think that's
something quick. Okay. Let's just. Can we do like 5 minutes or so, 7 minutes, so we can get started?
Sorry if I went a bit over.
No, you didn't. You didn't.
We did.